Hello, philosophers, and welcome to the God class. Yes, in this video we'll be talking about God as it comes up in Descartes, of course, especially in the third meditation. The way the video is going to work is something like this. First of all, I hope that you have gathered a couple of friends together to watch the video with you. The nice thing about a video presentation is you can pause it, you can back it up, you can speed it up, you can slow it way down. Often I'll suggest pauses to discuss. These will be exactly the sort of thing we would do in class, where I put you in small groups. Please do take these pauses. I think that they are the right moments for you to talk about the big ideas that are going to come across the screen here. At the end, you'll write a 5-minute paper, as usual, but that'll be set up so that you can actually see the responses of other students. So in a sense, the big discussion, the overall discussion, can occur after you've watched the video and after you have read the third meditation of Descartes. So where are we so far? The third meditation begins with Descartes giving a little synopsis of where he is at this moment. He's thinking, I'll now shut my eyes, block my ears, cut off all my senses. I'll regard all mental images of bodily things as empty, false, and worthless. I'll get into conversation with myself, examine myself more deeply, and try in this way to gradually get to know myself more intimately. We've seen where he's coming from to get to this point. The method of doubt, which excludes so much of his presuppositions that he might have read earlier. And then the cogito, the I think, therefore I am, or the equivalent, in meditation 2, and the further discussion where he decides that what he really knows is about himself. I am a thing that thinks. This is an expansive concept of the self in that it includes all sorts of other psychological states. It doubts, affirms, denies, understands, and so forth. It has imagination, his mind. And so on, and this is all from the third meditation. In a nutshell, Descartes has concluded that he thinks, from that he concludes that he exists, and then he went on in the second meditation to figure out what kind of thing he was. And the answer to that is, I am a thinking thing, in that broad sense we were just talking about. So here's our first pause, then, for you all to discuss among yourselves. 2 questions, in fact. First one is, why would Descartes need to introduce the question of God's existence at this point in the meditations? Given the stuff we've just walked through, the first 2 meditations, how does God's existence come up here? Why should it come up here? That's the first question. That's a question for Descartes in a sense. Why does Descartes need to move to God at this point? But there's a question for us as philosophers outside of the meditations, which is, why should we address this question? In other words, why should we address it in a philosophy class? So if you take a look at those 2, you can pause for as many hours as it takes, and we'll pick up there. Okay, you've paused, and you're back. Welcome back. So I shall suppose that some malicious, powerful, cunning demon has done all he can to deceive me, rather than this being done by God, who is supremely good and a source of truth. There's a hint on the first question right there, namely, that in the first meditation he came up with this thought experiment, which we varied into the matrix and Sims and everything else. This thought experiment of a malicious, powerful, evil God who is bent on deceiving Descartes in every conceivable way. Descartes is going to dwell on this possibility, and the reason he does that is in order to introduce more doubt. He can barely entertain the possibility of such a being, and so as long as that's there, his doubt is very pervasive. In other words, he has a hard time knowing anything else about the world beyond that beyond the fact that he exists. The threat he faces, the problem he faces, is the problem of solipsism. That's the view or theory that the self is all that can be known to exist. In other words, Descartes' mind at this moment is all that he can know, and he cannot rule out the possibility that that's all that there is nothing outside of his mind in the entire universe, and that he's radically alone. And so he needs at this very moment to escape the threat of solipsism. How will he do that? How will God help with that? Well, if God can dispel the evil demon, then we are back in the grounds where possibly we can talk about the existence of outside things. We can at least begin to talk about math and stuff like that. But we can talk about a God at least who is not a deceiver. And so for that reason, God is the next topic in the meditations. Before we turn to the second version of the question about why we turn to this topic in today's class, I did want to read to you a very nice commentary by a student from last year, in which the threat of solipsism actually is not so threatening. It's actually rather comforting. I cannot be separated from my thoughts. I like this certainty. When I sleep, I am with my thoughts, and maybe when I die, my mind or soul remains with my thoughts and finds a new form or vessel. Or maybe I don't need a bodily form at all. Maybe the mind or soul and linked thoughts exercise contemplation for eternity. Wouldn't that truly be heaven? It is a nice thought. You don't actually have to wait for eternity to appreciate it. The power of contemplation, the power of meditation. Okay, the second question I asked you was the question of why we should consider the issue of God in a philosophy class. After all, in this class, we are devoted to the practice of reason as our route to knowledge. And it is traditional, and you'll hear this from many people, for there to be a separation between faith and reason, belief and logic. Lots of people hold this separation, including a lot of scientists as it happens. And I just want to take a look at that, because you could say, well, faith is an entirely separate domain, and faith in God is a thing that we wouldn't touch, and that we should do our philosophy without actually looking at this, because we can't actually assess the faith in God. But often, and here's the reason why I think reason must get involved in this question, often faith and reason disagree. They give separate views of reality, separate advice about how to act. We encountered versions of this problem even in Euthyphro. And so when they collide, then it is impossible for us to say these are two totally separate things. They are actually, it's one or the other, and you've got to make a choice between them. Okay, so let's look at that situation where faith and reason collide. Suppose you say, I think one or the other should win. That reason should prevail over faith, or faith should prevail over reason. Notice that if you go either way on that question, you will have already given the prize to reason. Because if you put faith and reason and do pros and cons, one against the other, that's already reasoning. On the other hand, if you opt for faith and simply reject reason, you end up with a slightly different problem. That's the problem of blind faith, or the problem that anything goes. Without the weighing in of reason, it's not just the gods that are described in Scripture that we find ourselves arguing about. You can in fact believe anything you want. For example, you could have a very strong belief that there are clowns living in the sewers of around us here. And there's no constraint in that, because if you put that on the side of faith, there's no talking you out of it, because you have opted for faith. On the other hand, if you say, talk me out of it, then you have opted for reason in the collision of faith and reason. And so the problem of faith being isolated from reason is the problem that it becomes completely unconstrained and completely unguided by anything at all. In fact, anything goes in terms of what you might have as a tenet of faith. And you'd also be declaring that nobody can touch that nobody can take a look at that you can't take a look at it because it is, after all, faith. All right. What this means, I think, is that faith and reason must speak with each other. Or, to put it another way, about religious belief, we must apply reason. And I think Descartes certainly would have felt the same way as well, that it was part of the duty of philosophy to argue and establish the nature of God. And so for that reason, it is appropriate for us not only to read Descartes, but also, I think, to take this issue up independently of this. So here's a little warm-up. You're sitting there with your group of friends. And so what I'd like you to do is just sketch in your notes some of the attributes that you ascribe to God or the gods. And notice that you're not committing yourself to any existence here. You're not saying anything about whether you believe in these attributes or any being that has them, but it's just, what's the tradition here? What do people say are attributes of the God who seems to be hanging around these parts? So let's take a very brief pause just to do that. So you've got a list in front of you. Here's the pause. Or you have to make the pause, actually. It won't pause by itself. And you've got that list. All right, and so now we turn to the main body of today's class. I'm going to set out for you 3 classic arguments for the existence of God. This is from the tradition, from the Western philosophical tradition. And so we are going to diverge quite a bit from Descartes for a little while here, just because this is part of the greatest hits. And I think knowing about these arguments is very interesting. They really are interesting to ponder and to introduce to your friends, because they're not difficult arguments. They're a little bit mind-bending, but as you'll see, they rest on very different premises and are independently very interesting. So after each one, after I've explained each one, we'll have a pause, and that's your opportunity to discuss the argument with the people around you. To do that as long as you want, then we'll go on to the next argument and so forth. After we've done all 3 arguments, then we'll romp back through them, and I'll outline for you some of the classical critiques of the 3 arguments. And then we're going to look at a classic objection, counter-argument to the existence of God. In fact, we'll look at 2 counter-arguments, but one of them is classic. So here's argument number 1. It's called the Ontological Argument. Ontology, we remember, is the study of being, the science of being. It's approximately equivalent to metaphysical. And so this is an argument about the being of God. It's due to the philosopher Anselm, writing in the year 1077, so this is a very old argument. And here's how it goes, pretty simple. First of all, we start with the definition. We don't commit to too much on this. We just say, dictionary style, that we're going to define the thing we call God. We're going to define it as that being, none greater than which can be imagined, or the greatest being imaginable. The idea being that if you have 2 things you're imagining, A and B, and A is better than B in some way, then that being is greater than B. And so whenever you have 2 beings like this, the one that's greater is the one that's more in the spectrum of God, on the God spectrum, and eventually you get to the greatest extreme on this. So no matter what you posit as a positive feature of this being, God's the greatest of that, of its type. And that's a definition for the term of God. This is what we mean in language when we use God. Then the second premise is also very simple too, namely, existence in reality is greater than existence in the imagination. So among the ways to be greater than in the world is to exist. So for example, a $10 bill in my pocket is a greater thing than a $10 bill in my imagination. And so that idea that to exist in reality is greater than existence in imagination is the next premise. Therefore, God has existence in reality. That is, God exists. Why is that? Well, remember, God is the greatest being. And if existence in reality is greater than existence in the imagination, then existence in reality must be a property of God. Now, as I said, and now you get it, this is a bit of a mind bender. So online, I got a couple of different versions of this, and then we will continue with a few more examples, and that will be the argument. So here's another one of stating exactly the same argument. Now it's in slightly different words, and possibly this will help you wrap your head around it. Assuming that Anselm is trying to give a proof of God, his main argument is developed in proslogion. So he had wrote several of these short pieces they're called proslogions. So he begins as defining God, just as we did. That than which none greater can be conceived. That means it is impossible to think of anything with greater value, or which has qualities to a greater degree. And according to Anselm, even the fool who denies God has at least the concept of God present in his mind. But once we have the concept of God, we ask, does God exist merely in the understanding or in reality as well? If God existed merely in the understanding, then we could conceive of a being greater if that being exists. If the understanding is not as great as the being who exists. Therefore, only the greatest conceivable being cannot exist in the mind only. It must exist in reality as well. And here's another construal of it, very similar to the one I began with. God, by definition, is the greatest being possible. If God exists only in our minds, then it is possible for there to be a being greater than God, namely a being like God that exists in reality. But it is not possible for there to be a being greater than God. That's from premise 1. Therefore, God exists in reality. So this is the ontological argument. And I will pause right here for you to discuss this. Noticing that examples are very helpful here. And that's a good way into this, to produce as many examples as you can, and to look at each premise separately and assess it for its truth and make sure that it's a meaningful premise. So let's pause and do that for a bit. And you pause the video here and come back when you're ready. Okay. On to the next argument. Here's a hypothetical. Here's a what if. Suppose you're walking along on the beach and you look down and there is an artifact. There is a watch laying there in the sand. So this is a surprise. You pick it up, and of course, the first thing you assume about this is that there was someone who made the watch. When you come across a complex object like this, even though there's no sign of anyone else around, you say, oh, there's clearly a design here. There's clearly a designer who made this complex thing. It could not have come about by chance. This is the nutshell intuition behind the argument known as the teleological argument, sometimes known as the argument from design, and this comes up in certain corridors of intellectual thought as the argument from intelligent design. And here it is. It's a very simple argument. That complex things, complex artifacts cannot be created by chance, like the watch on the beach. Complex artifacts must therefore be created by something, according to a design of an intelligent creator. Well, a watch is pretty complicated, but the universe is incredibly complicated, more complex than any artifact. Therefore, the universe, being super complicated, must be created by an intelligent designer. So I think you get that pretty easily. And we'll turn to the critique in a few minutes, but I think we can turn this argument over to you. By the way, teleological. Teleology is the philosophical study of goals, of aims. That's the Greek word, telos, means end or goal. And so this is, when we talk about design, then we're talking about the goal in creating something. The idea is that artifacts, complex artifacts, have designs, which means they were created for a purpose. And again, the complexity of the universe exceeds all these other complexities. And so that's that argument. Pause to discuss, and we'll be back in a second. I do assume you've paused the video. And now you're back. The final of the big three arguments is called the cosmological argument. It's based on the nature of the cosmos itself. So here we have a schematic of the universe, starting at the left with the Big Bang, an extremely rapid period of expansion that eventually fans out to become the stars and then the galaxies and everything else that we know over a period of almost 14 billion years. Many of you have already raised the question, what happens before the Big Bang? Well, that's the essence of the cosmological argument. A version of this appears in Aristotle, and its premises are as follows. Every effect has a cause, and so the world, being an effect, has a cause. We can call it the world cause. But if every effect has a cause, then the world cause has a cause, the cause of the world cause. And so that must have a cause, etc., and that goes on and on forever. That's called a vicious regress, which means that in order for something to be true, something has to be true before it, and in order for that to be true, something has to be true before that, and it goes on forever and ever. It's endless, and that means it has no beginning, but that's absurd. There can't be a sequence of causes with no starting point. Therefore, there must be a first cause. That first cause is something that is not caused itself. And then when Aquinas in the Middle Ages develops this argument, he will say, and that we call God. Or in a kind of caricature version, we have causes leading causes, and so forth. The uncaused causer begins, and that leads eventually to the universe. And that's the cosmological argument. So I'll pause the playback now and take a look at that one. Are you convinced? Okay, I gave you a chance to go at these on your own. I didn't want to prejudge your response to any of them. They all are controversial. And now I want to walk through some of the standard objections to each of the big three, and then we'll go on from there. The ontological argument, well, there are a couple ways into this, but the one that has been most controversial, most doubtful in the hands of philosophy is the second one. Existence in reality is greater than existence in the imagination. That's a kind of peculiar statement. Of course, there are some things we prefer to have existing in reality, but to say that they're greater in themselves by virtue of existing, even though the situation might be greater that includes them in reality, it has struck people as kind of funny. People also object to the idea that we actually can grasp the definition in premise one, and so that is regarded as itself. If we have to grasp it in order to get the argument, if we can't grasp it, then we can't actually assert the argument meaningfully. The argument doesn't make sense. Here's an analogy which sort of signals some of the problems, which is we'll define a term, any term we want. We'll define something as, we'll call it Godwich. Godwich will be defined as the greatest possible sandwich, the sandwich none greater than which can be imagined. So we've simply defined the term, we've stipulated a definition, and we say, okay, we'll go with that. But by the second premise then, we get to the conclusion that the Godwich exists. Same exact argument, starting with the definition. The classical form of this was, so we can imagine a perfect island, the best of all islands, none greater than which can be imagined. And once we have that in our heads, then the argument leads us to conclude that island must exist. The teleological argument, when it's criticized, the critics usually take it to task on the idea of, well, on several premises, but certainly premise one, that complexity cannot arise by chance. Certainly complexity can arise by chance. And indeed, how does it arise by chance? Well, one example is natural selection. Evolution is one way in which simplicity develops itself, essentially, into complexity. And so we don't need an intelligent creator when you have basic evolution at work. And so that allows us to imagine the complexity of life, for example, is arising. Also, complexity arises from something that's neither design nor chance, but natural law. And so the universe itself gets a lot of complexity simply from the way atoms interact with each other. And so for those, all three premises are fairly weak in this argument. And that's the classical critique of that. Cosmological argument, well, really often is about that vicious regress. Why must there be a first cause? Why can't it go back forever in time? Imagine a sort of sequential or oscillating universe or something like that. There's no reason why it has to have a starting point. So that's one problem. Another is that even if you grant that it had to begin somehow, that there's a first cause, it's a total stretch to assign these sorts of properties that are on your list for God properties, including the idea that God is agency, has mind, and all this other stuff. The first cause need have nothing in common with any religious belief that anyone has. In any case, with respect to the sequence of causes being endless, there's a parable, and that is that there's I believe, an Asian religion that believes that the world is carried on the back of a turtle. And someone asks a sage, okay, if the world's on the back of a turtle, that's what holds the world up. What's the turtle on? And the sage replies wisely, it's turtles all the way down. So those are a couple reasons that people have asserted as reasonable reasons, as arguments in defense of the existence of God. Now we look at two problems, two counter-arguments overall. Of course, there are two ways to discuss this. First is to look at the strengths and weaknesses of the pro-arguments, but then we also look at counter-arguments, separate arguments that argue against the conclusion. The biggest of these, and this is a very serious problem, is called the problem of evil. So if we posit a being like the God which is frequently posited in religion, namely a being who is all-powerful, who knows everything, and is absolutely as good as can be, we raise the obvious question of why is there evil? And we don't have to look far, unfortunately, for evils in our world. Hundreds of people died in an earthquake in Mexico. There is still devastation in the Caribbean, and these are events that nobody is responsible for. And so there's not an easy answer for why they exist. What makes it good that a baby dies of tuberculosis or some other illness? It's hard to make the case for that. And so then it's hard to make the case that there is an all-powerful, all-knowing, all-good being, because such a being would certainly prevent at least some evils. There would be some intervention there that would prevent the evils from occurring. So that's the problem of evil. And I think that this is a very good moment for a quick pause for you to take a look at that. So pause the playback now if you would. Okay, and welcome back. Here's the second issue, and we'll call it the problem of scientific closure. The world is defined by an elaborate set of equations. And the equations simply represent our understanding of the way the world works, that by the use of a couple of variables, we can actually say a lot about the nature of reality. So science is a system by which, ultimately, we expect to have equations that cover just about everything. Important stuff, though, is that we do have equations that cover things like gravity, that cover cause and effect, that cover the behavior of light and all sorts of other things. It's a closed system. In other words, there is no place in this system of equations, or this way of thinking, there's no place where a God could intervene. In other words, anything that a God might do would absolutely violate the entire system of science. And so it's not just that a miracle is something that could pop up and go away again. Any miracle at all completely undermines the reality of all of these systems that we understand to be the natural world. And so if a person really puts to themselves the question of, empirically speaking, is there a God? The answer is a decisive no from the respect of science. And that brings us all the way back to the science and faith question, which is, at what point then can you say, no, I'm going to reject these equations and believe in clowns in the sewers instead? That puts you on a very unsteady footing indeed. And so scientific closure then becomes a positive argument against the existence of violations of the natural order. And that's not hard to violate the natural order. What I mean by that is that there's not a lot of space for God to intervene in the natural world without violating our total understanding of the way that world works. So let's take a pause there, and you can talk about whether you're persuaded by that or if there's a workaround on that. And all of these are potential topics for your 5-minute papers at the end. So pause the video. We'll be back in a second. Well, as soon as you're ready. And so now you're ready to read Meditation 3, or even better, to read Meditation 3 for the second time. Now, you should read the whole thing because Descartes sets up his methods for thinking. He sets up his standards for conviction, for believing in something early in this. And then the argument about God kicks in. In class, there's a handout that gave you a condensed version of that argument, but I hope you will read that in the context of the whole thing. Now, if you've made it to this point in the video, good, congratulations. Please do email me to let me know that you've seen this, and you can drop me a line saying that, and I will set aside a tiny bit of extra credit for you. With that, that's the God Show, and good luck with grappling with Meditation 3. It is not trivial, but it is an argument that is very worth looking at. And the opening question, I think, which may help you make sense of this argument is, given the three arguments that we talked about, does Descartes use aspects of those arguments? Is there something like one of the other arguments, or maybe two of them together, that are part of Descartes' strategy for establishing this? It's a hybrid argument that he's going to make. So good luck with that, and I'll see you in class.